You owe me half, Sarah. $25,000. That's only fair. My brother Marcus said this with the same casual entitlement he'd used his entire life, as if he were asking me to pass the salt rather than demanding half of my lottery winnings. We were sitting in our parents' dining room, the same room where I'd spent 34 years learning exactly how little I mattered, and I watched him lean back in his chair with that familiar expression of absolute certainty that the world would bend to his wishes because it always had. 2 weeks ago, I'd won $50,000 on a scratch-off ticket, a moment of pure, unexpected joy that I'd stupidly shared with my mother in a moment of excitement. And within 3 hours, Marcus had called me with his hand already out, his voice carrying that blend of brotherly warmth and underlying demand that I'd heard 1,000 times before. Now here we were, my parents nodding along as Marcus laid out his case for why my money should become our money. Because that's what family does, he said. Family shares everything, apparently forgetting that this principle had only ever flowed in one direction. Marcus is right, honey, my mother said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with that gentle pressure that wasn't gentle at all. It's a blessing, and blessings should be shared. Marcus and Jessica have the new baby, and you know how expensive everything is with 3 children. My father cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to deliver wisdom. You're single now, Sarah. No mortgage, no kids, no real responsibilities. Marcus needs it more than you do. I sat there listening to them divvy up my winnings as if I weren't present, as if my opinion were merely a formality before the inevitable conclusion. And I felt something inside me that had been bending for decades finally reach its breaking point. I thought about Marcus at 16 getting a brand new Honda Civic while I got a card that said, maybe next year, about his college tuition paid in full, $120,000, while I worked 3 jobs and graduated with debt that took me 8 years to clear. I thought about the $40,000 down payment our parents gave him for his first house, while I got a $500 check on my 30th birthday, with a note saying they wished it could be more. But times were tight. Even though times hadn't been tight enough to stop them from funding Marcus's 3rd failed business venture that same year. Well, Marcus said, pulling out his phone, should I send you my account info now, or do you want to write a check? He smiled at me, that big brother smile that had always made me feel small, and I realized with perfect clarity that he genuinely believed I would say yes, that I would hand over half of the first lucky thing that had happened to me in years, because I always gave in, I always bent, I always made myself smaller so he could take up more room. I looked at my parents, at their expectant faces, at the way they were already nodding approval at Marcus's financial planning, and I thought about the folder in my purse, the one I'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. Before we talk about the lottery money, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected, I need to show you something. Marcus got the Honda Civic when he turned 16, a gleaming silver 2-door that our father drove home with the enormous red bow stuck to the hood. And I remember standing in the driveway watching Marcus whoop with joy while our mother took pictures, her face glowing with the pleasure of giving him exactly what he wanted. And when I turned 16 2 years later, I got a card with a $50 bill inside and a note that said, maybe next year, sweetie, even though next year never came. And that wasn't the moment I understood the pattern, but it was the moment I started keeping track. Started noticing the way resources flowed in one direction in our family, like a river that only knew how to run downhill toward Marcus. We grew up in Cincinnati, in a comfortable suburb where the houses all had neat lawns and the schools were good enough that our parents could feel virtuous about their choices. And Marcus was the golden child from the beginning, the firstborn son who could do no wrong even when he did plenty wrong, while I was the afterthought, the daughter who was supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps fell from the family table. When Marcus went to Ohio State, the tuition bills came to $120,000 over 4 years, and our parents paid every penny, never even suggesting he get a job or take out loans. But when my turn came 2 years later, suddenly money was tight and education was an investment I needed to make in myself. So I worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and graduated with $38,000 in debt that took me 8 years of brutal monthly payments to clear. 8 years of eating ramen and skipping movies and wearing the same 4 outfits in rotation, while Marcus lived in a nice apartment our parents helped furnish and took ski trips he posted about on social media. The house down payment was $40,000, handed to Marcus when he was 26 and decided he was ready to stop renting, just a casual gift that our parents presented as a normal expression of parental love. And I remember Marcus calling me to brag about his new 3-bedroom colonial, his voice full of excitement that never once included awareness that he'd been given something extraordinary. And 4 years later, when I turned 30 and had been saving desperately for my own down payment, I got that $500 birthday check, the one with the note about wishing it could be more, even though I absolutely knew, that 5 months earlier they'd given Marcus $18,000 to prop up his failing marketing consultancy, the second business venture they'd bankrolled after the first one collapsed. I was always told to be grateful, to not make waves, to understand that Marcus had different needs because he was building a life. As if I weren't also building a life, as if my life somehow counted less because I built it quietly, without asking for help I knew wouldn't come, and my quiet competence became invisible, while Marcus's loud mediocrity was celebrated as excellence, his every small achievement trumpeted while my actual accomplishments vanished into silence. And this pattern stretched across 20 years, from childhood through adolescence, through my entire adult life, until I was sitting at that dinner table listening to him demand half my lottery winnings and feeling something inside me finally refuse to bend anymore. The pattern didn't stop when we became adults. It just evolved into more expensive forms of the same essential truth that Marcus mattered more than I did. And over the 5 years between my 30th and 35th birthdays, our parents poured $85,000 into Marcus's failing business ventures. First, the marketing consultancy that collapsed after 14 months when he couldn't keep a single client. Then the real estate investment scheme that lost money every quarter until our father quietly paid off the debts. Then the partnership in a friend's restaurant that went under before it even opened. And each time Marcus came to our parents with his hand out, they opened their wallets with expressions of supportive concern, praising his entrepreneurial spirit and risk-taking courage, while I worked steadily at a job they never asked about and built a life they never saw. When I asked our mother for $2,000 to help with an emergency car repair 3 years ago, after my transmission died and I was between paychecks, she'd sighed and said, "You're so independent, Sarah. You always figure things out on your own," and sent me $500 with a note suggesting I look into public transportation. And 2 months later, I watched her write Marcus a check for $12,000 to cover his mortgage payments after one of his ventures went south. And the math wasn't the thing that hurt. It was the casual assumption that I didn't need help while Marcus deserved rescue, as if needing and deserving were somehow related to who we fundamentally were rather than what we asked for. Marcus's wedding had been an elaborate affair at a country club, $60,000 of flowers and prime rib, and a band that played until midnight, and our parents had paid $30,000 of it, half the total, beaming with pride as Marcus and Jessica danced their first dance. But when I got married 3 years ago to David, in a small ceremony at a local restaurant, because that's what we could afford, our parents contributed $2,000 and seemed vaguely annoyed that I was asking for anything at all. My mother commenting that intimate weddings are so much more meaningful anyway, in a tone that suggested I should be grateful for my poverty. And when my marriage fell apart last year, when David's emotional abuse finally became undeniable and I filed for divorce, my mother's first response was, "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" And my father suggested marriage counseling even after I explained why I was leaving. And for 3 months they maintained a friendship with David, inviting him to family events and posting old photos of him on social media, like my pain was an inconvenience rather than something that required their attention. The career disparity was maybe the strangest part because it was so obviously backwards. Marcus worked at a financial services firm owned by our father's college friend, a job he'd been handed after his third business failure, doing something vague with client relations that he described in buzzwords. And our parents talked about his career like he was running Goldman Sachs, asking detailed questions about his projects and bragging to their friends about his success, while I worked at what I worked at, doing what I did. And they'd wave their hands dismissively when anyone asked, saying I did something with computers or office work, something technical, in the same tone you'd use to describe a nice hobby someone had, something pleasant but not serious. And the resentment built year after year, alongside a creeping self-doubt that maybe they were right, maybe I didn't deserve more, maybe being invisible was just my natural state. 2 weeks ago, I stopped at the Quick Mart on Madison Avenue, the one I pass every Thursday on my way home from the office, and bought a scratch-off ticket on a whim, a $5 Lucky Fortune card that I scratched with a quarter while standing in the parking lot, and when the symbols lined up to show $50,000, I felt a jolt of pure euphoria that lasted maybe 45 seconds before my brain started calculating logistics. And my very first thought, the one that rose up immediately after the shock, was that I should keep this completely secret, tell absolutely no one, just quietly claim the money and let it disappear into my accounts where it would be safe from everyone who might want a piece of it. But I made a mistake, a stupid, impulsive mistake born from decades of conditioning and a pathetic desire for approval. I still hadn't fully killed, and I called my mother that evening, told her about the win with genuine excitement in my voice, thinking maybe this time, this one time, she'd just be happy for me, just share my joy without complicating it. And for about 90 seconds she did seem happy, making excited noises and asking where I'd bought the ticket, like that detail mattered. And then I heard her voice shift into that calculating tone I knew so well, the one that meant she was already working out how this affected Marcus, and she said, "That's wonderful, honey. Have you told your brother yet?" And I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly where this was heading. Within 3 hours, Marcus called, his voice full of forced casualness, saying he'd heard my good news and wasn't that amazing? And then, without any preamble at all, he launched into why family shares windfalls, how we're all in this together, how his third baby had just been born, and Jessica was overwhelmed, and they really needed to renovate the nursery, turn the spare room into something proper. And 50,000 split 2 ways was still 25,000 each, which would be life-changing for both of us. And I listened to him talk for 15 minutes about his needs, his plans, his family, never once asking what I might do with the money, or whether I had any needs of my own. And when I finally said I needed to think about it, he'd gotten quiet in that dangerous way and said, "Think about what exactly? It's family, Sarah." Like that word was supposed to settle everything. My mother called back the next day with the same message wrapped in gentler language. "It's just money, Sarah. Marcus needs it more than you do." My father sent a text, brief and direct. "Your brother could use help right now. Do the right thing." And for a week, I actually considered it. Actually lay awake at night, thinking, maybe I should just give him half. Give him all of it. Prove I was generous and good and worthy of being loved. That pathetic voice inside me that still believed if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, diminished myself enough, they might finally see me as valuable. And part of me knew this dinner invitation wasn't really an invitation, but a summons, a family tribunal where I'd be expected to hand over the money with a smile. And I came here tonight telling myself I was weighing my options. But somewhere deep down, I think I already knew what I was going to do. I just needed to see it play out one more time, needed to watch the pattern repeat itself with perfect clarity, so I could finally let myself break free. The dining room hadn't changed in the 20 years since my parents bought this house in the Westchester suburb of Cincinnati. The same heavy oak table that had witnessed every family milestone and disappointment. The same cream-colored walls that seemed to absorb sound and make everything feel muffled and distant. The same formal china cabinet displaying plates we never used except for holidays when we pretended to be closer than we were. And I sat in my usual chair, the one facing the kitchen door, the one that felt somehow smaller than the others, though they were all identical, and Marcus sat across from me in his usual spot, the head of the table to our father's right, the position of favor he'd occupied since childhood, and he had papers spread out in front of him, actual printed documents he'd brought to this dinner like he was presenting a business proposal rather than demanding half of my lottery winnings. And he walked us through his plan with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, explaining how $25,000 would cover the nursery renovation, another $8,000 for a new SUV since Jessica's sedan wasn't practical with 3 kids, maybe $7,000 to pad their emergency fund, and the rest could go toward a family vacation, Disney World probably. The kids would love it. And he spoke with this calm authority, like he was doing me a favor by organizing how my money should be spent, and my mother nodded along, saying, "See how responsible Marcus is? This is why we invest in him." Like his ability to spend money he didn't have was evidence of superior character, and my father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, looking at me with that expression I knew so well, the one that said I was about to disappoint him, but he'd expected nothing less. "Sarah, you're single now, no kids. You don't need that much," my father said, and the casualness of it hit me like a slap. The way my entire life could be summarized as single, no kids, as if those facts meant I didn't have needs or wants or dreams or a future worth funding. And Jessica spoke up for the first time, her voice sweet with false sincerity, saying, "We'd do the same for you if situations were reversed. You know that." And I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her designer purse hanging on her chair, and I knew it was a lie. Knew they'd never once offered me anything without being asked, never once checked if I needed help or support, or even just someone to talk to. And something shifted in me right then. Some internal tectonic plate that had been pressing down for decades finally cracking and moving. And I saw the scene with sudden startling clarity, saw myself sitting at this table like I'd sat 1,000 times before, making myself smaller and quieter and less demanding, apologizing for taking up space. And I saw them across from me, so certain of their right to what was mine, so comfortable in their assumptions about my life and my worth. And I remembered the folder in my purse, the one I'd been carrying for 3 days, not quite sure if I'd have the courage to use it, and I felt that courage crystallize inside me like ice forming, cold and hard and clear. Enough was enough. I set down my water glass with deliberate care, the small clink against the wooden table somehow cutting through Marcus's monologue about nursery paint colors. And I looked at him directly for the first time since we'd sat down to dinner, and I asked in a voice that came out calmer than I expected, "Marcus, what do you think I do for a living?" He paused mid-sentence, his fork hovering over his plate, and looked at me with obvious irritation at being interrupted, and he waved his hand dismissively and said, "Some computer thing, right? Tech support or something?" And the casualness of his ignorance hit me harder than outright cruelty would have, the way he didn't even bother to pretend he knew, didn't feel embarrassed by not knowing. And I turned to my mother and asked, "Mom, do you know what I do?" And she glanced at my father before answering. "Office work, something technical, you've mentioned it." Her voice uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the question, and my father added, "Computer programming, databases, that sort of thing." And I sat there looking at the 3 of them plus Jessica who was studying her napkin, and I felt something like sadness mixed with clarity. The kind of feeling you get when you finally understand a truth you've been avoiding for years. And I said clearly, "I'm a senior software architect at Nexus Solutions." And I watched their faces for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the name of one of the most prestigious tech companies in the Midwest meant something to them. But I saw only blank stares and growing impatience, and Marcus said, "Okay, that's great, sis, but we're talking about real money here, not job titles." And I felt myself smile, a small movement of my lips that probably looked strange to them, knowing and calm and maybe a little sad, and I reached down for my purse that I'd hung on the back of my chair, The leather bag I'd bought myself last year from a designer boutique in Chicago after signing the biggest contract of my career. And I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for 3 days, the manila folder with documents I'd printed and organized, and told myself I might not need, might not have the courage to show. And I set it on the table between the serving dishes and said, "Before we discuss the lottery winnings, I want to show you something." And Marcus actually groaned and said, "Come on, Sarah, we don't need a PowerPoint presentation about why you want to keep the money." And Jessica laughed a little at that, a nervous titter. And my mother looked between us with growing anxiety, saying, "Let's not make this complicated, honey." And my father's expression had shifted to annoyance. That look that said I was wasting everyone's time with my dramatics, being difficult as always, making everything about me when we were supposed to be solving Marcus's problems. And I sat there with my hand on the folder, feeling the weight of what was inside, 8 years of my career distilled into paper and numbers, proof of a life they'd never once asked to see, and the tension in the room built like pressure before a storm. And I knew that opening this folder would change everything, would shatter their comfortable assumptions about who I was and what I was worth. And I felt ready for that shattering, needed it even, needed them to finally see what they'd been too blind or too indifferent to notice for so long. I opened the folder with hands that didn't shake, though my heart was pounding, and I pulled out the first document, a bank statement I'd printed 3 days ago, and I slid it across the table to Marcus, who picked it up with casual dismissiveness, like he was humoring a child. And I watched his eyes scan the page once, twice, then stop and widen, and the color drained from his face in a way that would have been satisfying if I'd felt anything besides a strange hollow calm. And he stared at the number at the bottom of the page, the balance that read $847,000 in my primary savings account. And the silence that fell over the table was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the next room, and my mother reached across and took the statement from Marcus's frozen grip. And she looked at it, and then at me, and said, "That can't be real. Is this a joke?" Her voice high and uncertain, and I said calmly, my voice steady in a way it had never been in this house before, "That's just my primary savings account. Would you like to see my investment portfolio?" And my father grabbed the statement next, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and he studied it like he was looking for evidence of forgery. And he said, "How would you have that kind of money?" The suspicion in his voice clear, like I must have done something wrong or illegal to accumulate what he'd never imagined I could possess. And I felt myself settle deeper into my chair, felt the power shift in the room like a physical thing. And I said, "My base salary is $285,000 annually. Plus, I have stock options from Nexus Solutions that have vested over the past 6 years, currently worth approximately $400,000. Plus my annual bonuses, which average $75,000, depending on project completion and company performance." And I listed these numbers like I was reciting a grocery list, like they were simple facts instead of the evidence of 8 years of 60-hour weeks and weekend coding sessions and presentations to executives and late nights debugging systems and building something from nothing. And Marcus finally found his voice, sputtering, "Why didn't you tell us?" And the question was so absurd, so perfectly encapsulating everything wrong with our family that I almost laughed, and instead I said quietly, "You never asked, Marcus. You never wanted to know." And I looked at each of them in turn, at my mother clutching the bank statement like it might disappear, at my father still squinting at the numbers, like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense in his understanding of who I was, at Jessica, who had gone very still and quiet, at Marcus, who looked like someone had punched him in the stomach, and I felt the years of invisibility lifting off me like weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. And I thought about all the times I'd tried to tell them about a promotion or a successful project or an award, how their eyes had glazed over or they'd changed the subject to Marcus's latest venture, or the grandchildren, or anything other than my life. And now they could see me finally, really see me. And it was because of a number on a page, because money was the only language they'd ever really understood. And that realization made me sadder than angry, but I felt both emotions mixing in my chest as I reached for the next document in my folder. I pulled the next document from the folder, a real estate closing statement from 4 years ago, and I slid it across to my father, who was closest, and I said, I bought a condo in downtown Cincinnati 4 years ago, paid cash, $340,000. And I watched his eyebrows rise as he scanned the document, seeing my signature, seeing the amount, seeing the date that proved I'd been building this life while they'd been oblivious. And my mother said, "You own property?" Like the concept was impossible. And I nodded and continued, my voice gaining strength with each revelation. I also own an investment property in Columbus, a duplex I bought 2 years ago for $280,000. It generates rental income of $2,400 a month. And I had more documents ready, had printed my investment portfolio summary that showed stock holdings worth approximately $1.2 million, spread across index funds and tech sector investments and bonds, and I had my retirement account statements showing I'd maxed out contributions every year for the past 8 years, accounts now worth over $400,000. And I laid these out one by one like I was presenting evidence in a trial, which in a way I was, a trial where I'd been found guilty of being worthless, without ever getting to testify in my own defense. And Marcus interrupted, his voice rising with something that sounded like anger but looked like panic. If you're so rich, why didn't you help us? And the question was so perfectly Marcus, so completely missing the point that I almost felt sorry for him. And I said calmly, my hands folded on the table in front of me, "You never asked for help, Marcus. You demanded money from Mom and Dad. You never once called me, never once thought I might have anything to offer." And I remembered suddenly all the times over the years when he'd had financial troubles, when he'd called our parents in crisis, and not once had he picked up the phone to call me. Not once had it occurred to him that his little sister might be capable of helping, and I realized it was because he'd never seen me as having anything worth taking, had never valued me enough to even consider asking. And my mother said, "Why did you let us think you were struggling?" Her voice confused and a little defensive. And I turned to her and said clearly, "I never said I was struggling, Mom. You assumed. You assumed because you never asked about my life, never wanted details, never showed interest in anything beyond surface pleasantries." And I watched her face as the realization dawned, as she started to understand the years of dismissal, the way they'd created an image of me in their minds that had nothing to do with who I actually was. And my father was still holding the magazine, and I could see his hands shaking slightly, and I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness, because this moment I'd imagined so many times in my anger felt hollow now that it was happening, felt less like victory and more like mourning for all the years we'd lost to their blindness and my invisibility. I reached back into the folder and pulled out the next set of documents, pages I'd printed last week, when I'd first decided that if this dinner happened, I would finally show them everything. And the first one was a certificate printed on heavy cream-colored paper, an award from the National Tech Innovation Council naming me one of the top 50 women in tech for 2023. And I slid it across the table and said, "This is the third year in a row I've received this recognition. I was on the list in 2021 and 2022 as well." And my mother picked it up with tentative fingers like it might burn her, and she stared at my name printed in elegant script beneath the organizational seal, and I pulled out the next document, a magazine, Tech Leader Monthly from 6 months ago, and I opened it to the marked page and placed it in front of my father. And there I was in a full-color photograph spanning 2 pages, sitting in my office at Nexus Solutions with my team gathered around me, the headline reading, "Sarah Chen, Architecting the Future of AI Integration." And it was a 4-page feature article with pull quotes and technical diagrams and testimonials from industry leaders. And my father stared at the magazine like he was looking at a stranger, and I said, "I sent you both a copy when it came out. I wrote a note on the cover asking if you'd read it." And my mother's face went pale because she was remembering now, remembering the magazine that had arrived in the mail, that she'd probably glanced at and set aside and forgotten. And I continued pulling out documents, a printed list of my speaking engagements over the past 3 years, conferences in San Francisco and Boston and Austin and Seattle, where I'd been invited as a keynote speaker, and I said, my standard fee for a keynote is $15,000, though sometimes I waive it for nonprofits or educational institutions. And I watched Marcus's jaw clench as he processed that number, understanding that I made more for a single hour-long speech than he made in months at his job. And I pulled out the final documents, patent certificates for 3 AI-related innovations I'd developed, systems for neural network optimization and data processing algorithms, and I explained, these patents generate licensing revenue. Companies pay to use the technology I invented. And I didn't mention the specific amounts because somehow that felt like too much, but I could see them doing the math in their heads, trying to calculate what my life actually looked like, and my father was still holding the magazine, his hands trembling slightly, and he kept looking between the professional photograph of me and my actual face across the table like he couldn't reconcile the two images, and he said, "We didn't know," and the words felt hollow, felt like an excuse that didn't excuse anything. And I said quietly, I invited you to my keynote speech in Chicago last year. It was in March. I sent you both tickets and hotel information 2 months in advance. And my mother's eyes widened with memory, and my father looked down at the table, and I continued. You said you couldn't make it because you were busy that weekend. And I looked at Marcus and said, you had a golf tournament, and Mom and Dad drove 4 hours to watch you play. And the silence that followed was suffocating. And I realized that this moment wasn't about revenge, wasn't about making them feel guilty. It was about finally being seen, about standing in the light after years of invisibility and saying, here I am. This is who I've been while you weren't looking. And I glanced at Jessica, who had gone very quiet, her calculating expression revealing that she was reassessing everything she'd thought she knew about her husband's family. And I felt tired suddenly, exhausted by the weight of all these years of being overlooked. Marcus recovered quickly from his shock the way he always did when confronted with anything that challenged his worldview, and he switched tactics with the smooth desperation of someone used to talking his way out of consequences. And he said, so you were just hoarding money while your family struggled? His voice taking on a tone of moral indignation like I was the villain in this story, and I felt something shift inside me, a final thread of patience snapping, and I said calmly, what struggles, Marcus? Dad paid your rent twice last year when you couldn't make payments. That was $4,800, and Mom bought Jessica's car 2 years ago. That was $22,000. So please tell me about these struggles. And I watched his face redden because he hadn't expected me to have the numbers memorized, hadn't expected me to have been paying attention to every bailout and rescue while I'd been building my own life without anyone's help, and he said, that was different, Sarah. We have kids. We have responsibilities. And his voice carried that self-righteous tone that had always made my parents nod in agreement. And I said quietly, and I have a life that you've never once asked about. I have responsibilities and achievements and challenges that none of you have ever shown the slightest interest in knowing. And my mother interrupted, her voice taking on that particular pleading quality she used when she wanted to smooth over conflict without actually addressing it, and she said, let's not fight. We're family. Family doesn't keep score like this. And I turned to her and said, family knows each other, Mom. Family asks questions. Family shows genuine interest in each other's lives. Family doesn't just show up when there's money to take. And my father's face hardened the way it always did when he felt his authority being challenged, and he said, this is about the lottery money, Sarah, and you're being selfish. Your brother has legitimate needs, and you're sitting on more money than you could ever spend. And something inside me reached a breaking point, and my voice stayed calm, but the words came out sharp and clear, and I said, I won $50,000 2 weeks ago, but before that, I'd already won. I've been winning for years while you weren't watching, while you weren't paying attention, while you were investing all your energy and resources and attention into Marcus. And I gestured to the documents spread across the table, the evidence of a successful life they'd never bothered to see. And I said, the lottery ticket is nothing compared to what I've built. It's pocket change, it's irrelevant, and the fact that you only care about me now because you think I have money to give tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to this family." And Marcus leaned forward, and I could see him trying to find an angle, trying to locate the argument that would get him what he wanted, and he said, "So you'll share it, right? Since it's nothing to you, since you have so much, you'll give me my half?" And I looked at him and saw clearly for the first time how he'd never grown up, how he was still the entitled teenager who'd gotten the new car while I'd taken the bus. And I knew my answer even before the words formed. I said no, and the single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. And I watched the ripples of shock spread across their faces, and I said it again with more force. "No, Marcus, I'm not giving you a single dollar of the lottery money." And the room erupted, my mother's voice rising in disbelief, my father's face flushing red with anger, Marcus half standing from his chair, and Jessica leaning over to whisper something furious in his ear, and my mother said, "After everything we've done for you?" And her voice carried that particular tone of wounded martyrdom that had made me feel guilty 1,000 times before. But this time, I felt nothing except clarity, and I said, "Let's talk about everything you've done, Mom, because I've been keeping track even if you haven't, and since Marcus turned 18, you and Dad have given him over $180,000 in direct financial support. And I've calculated that number many times, so I know it's accurate. And in that same period, you've given me less than 10,000 total." And I watched my father's mouth open to protest, and I continued before he could speak. "I'm not angry about the money itself. I want you to understand that. I'm not sitting here calculating dollars and cents like they matter. I'm hurt that you never saw me, that you never looked at me the way you look at Marcus, that I could build an entire successful life and you wouldn't notice because you were too busy rescuing him from consequences." And my father said, "That's not fair, Sarah. We treated you both the same. We loved you equally." And I felt something break open inside me, and I said, "Then why can't any of you name my job title? What company do I work for? What city do I live in? Where is my condo?" And I looked at each of them in turn, and the silence that followed was devastating because I could see them searching their memories and coming up empty. And my mother said hesitantly, "You're downtown somewhere, aren't you?" And I said, "I moved 2 years ago, Mom. I bought a condo in the Riverfront district, and I invited you to my housewarming party, and you said you couldn't make it because you were helping Marcus move into his rental." And I saw her face crumble slightly with memory, and I said, "You're still sending my Christmas cards to my old apartment. I know because my former neighbor told me when I ran into her last month. She's been collecting them for 2 years." And Marcus said, "This is ridiculous, Sarah. You're being dramatic. Families don't memorize every detail about each other." And I stood up from the table, my legs steady beneath me, and I said, "You're right, Marcus. Families don't memorize details, but they pay attention, they show interest, they ask questions, and none of you have ever done that for me." And I picked up my purse in the folder of documents, and my father said, "Sit down, we're not finished here." And I said, "Yes, we are. I'm finished. I've been finished for a long time, but I kept hoping you'd finally see me." And I walked toward the dining room door. I stopped at the doorway and turned back because there were things they needed to hear, things I'd carried silently for years that had to be spoken aloud, even if they changed nothing. And I said, "Before I leave, I need you to understand what you actually missed while you were so focused on Marcus." And my mother said, "Sarah, please don't leave like this." But I continued because this wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about truth, and I said, "My divorce that you barely acknowledged, the one where you told me to give him another chance when I called you crying, that was because he was emotionally abusive. He spent 2 years tearing down my self-esteem and isolating me from friends. And when I finally left him, I called you Mom, and you said I should work it out because marriage takes effort." And I watched my mother's face go pale, and I said, "Marcus knew about the abuse because I told him once when he actually answered my call, and he never checked on me again. Not once in the year it took me to rebuild my life." And Marcus said, "I didn't know it was that serious." And I said, "You didn't ask. You heard what you wanted to hear and moved on because my problems weren't interesting to you. And I turned to my father and said, when I got promoted to senior architect 3 years ago, it was the biggest achievement of my career, the thing I'd worked towards since graduate school, and I sent you all an email with the announcement. I even attached a photo from the celebration, and not one of you responded. Not even a congratulations text. Nothing. And my father opened his mouth, but no words came out, and I continued. My miscarriage 3 years ago, before the divorce, when I was still hoping I could make that marriage work. I lost a baby at 12 weeks. And I told you, Mom. I called you from the hospital and you said these things happen and we never spoke about it again. And my voice cracked slightly, but I kept going. Marcus doesn't even know about it because you never told him, because my grief wasn't important enough to share, and I spent that Christmas at your house watching you all celebrate while I was hollow inside, and nobody noticed. And tears were streaming down my mother's face now, but I couldn't stop, and I said, every award I've won, every speaking engagement I've been invited to, every achievement that meant something to me, I documented them all, and I sent you invitations and announcements and links to articles, and you acknowledged none of it. But now that you think I have money to give, suddenly I'm worth your attention. And I looked at each of them, and I said, I wanted you to be proud of me. I wanted you to see me and know me and care about the life I built. But instead, you saw me as the self-sufficient one who didn't need anything. And that gave you permission to invest everything in Marcus. And my voice steadied, and I said, I'm done trying to earn your attention. I'm done hoping that maybe this achievement will be the one that makes you see me. I'm done shrinking myself to make Marcus look bigger. And the silence that followed felt like the end of something. My father was the first to try damage control, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when he wanted to smooth over conflict, and he said, Sarah, sweetheart, we didn't realize you wanted us more involved in your life. You have to understand that you always seemed so capable, so together. We thought you preferred your independence. And I felt the familiar pull of his words trying to reshape reality. And I said, I was independent because I had to be, Dad. Because every time I needed anything, you were busy with Marcus, busy fixing his problems, or celebrating his mediocrity, or funding his next failed venture. And my mother stood up from the table, her hands reaching toward me in a gesture that might have been pleading, and she said, You always seemed like you didn't need us, Sarah. Like you had everything figured out. Marcus needed more help, more guidance, and we thought we were doing the right thing. And I heard the justification in her voice, the narrative they'd constructed to make their choices acceptable, and I said, Needing you and showing you. I needed you are two different things. I stopped showing you because you never responded, and eventually I learned to stop needing you at all. And Marcus pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loud against the hardwood floor, and his voice shifted from anger to something that sounded almost like desperation, and he said, Come on, sis. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't understand. I didn't see it. Let's start over. Let's fix this. And I recognized that tone immediately. The same voice he'd used when we were kids and he wanted to borrow something of mine. The same practiced contrition that had worked 1,000 times before, and I felt nothing except a distant sadness that he still thought manipulation would work. And then Jessica spoke, her voice cutting through the emotional tension with a jarring practicality, and she said, How much is your condo worth now, Sarah? I mean, property values in Riverfront have gone up significantly, haven't they? And I saw it then, saw the calculation in her eyes and in Marcus's sudden attentiveness. And I understood that even in this moment of supposed revelation and apology, they were assessing my worth in dollars, measuring what they might access, and something crystallized inside me with absolute clarity, and I said, The lottery money is already spoken for. I made the decision before I came here tonight, and the entire $50,000 is being donated to Haven House, Cincinnati. And I watched their faces shift through confusion to disbelief, and my mother said, Haven House? The women's shelter? And I said, Yes, I'm making the donation in my own name. The check is already written. I'm delivering it tomorrow afternoon. And my father's face flushed darker. And he said, "You're giving $50,000 to strangers instead of your own family?" And I said, "I'm giving it to women who need help, women who are leaving abusive situations and rebuilding their lives, women like I was 3 years ago when I needed help and didn't get it." And my mother gasped and said, "We would have helped if you'd asked." But I shook my head and said, "I did ask, Mom. I called you crying from a hotel room after I left him, and you told me to go back and work it out. And Marcus, you knew he was tearing me apart, and you never called once to check if I was okay." And the truth sat heavy in the room, and I said, "Those women at Haven House, they'll use that money to escape and survive and start over, the same way I had to do alone. And that matters more to me than maintaining this fiction that we're a close family." I left my parents' house that night and drove home through the familiar streets of Cincinnati with the windows down, letting the cool October air wash over me. And I felt something I hadn't expected, a profound sense of peace settling over me, like a weight lifting rather than descending. And when I got back to my condo in the riverfront district, I sat on my balcony overlooking the Ohio River and simply breathed, knowing that whatever happened next, I had finally told the truth, and that mattered more than their response. 1 week later, my mother called, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and her voice was small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before, and she said, "Sarah, I've been thinking about everything you said, and I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't see what we were doing to you." And the apology felt awkward and incomplete, but also genuine, and I said, "Thank you for saying that." And we talked for 20 minutes about surface things, because neither of us knew how to go deeper yet. But it was a beginning. 2 days after that, my father sent an email, which was typical of him because difficult emotions always came easier in writing, and the subject line said, "Proud of you." And I stared at those 3 words for a long time before opening it. And the email was short, talking about how he'd looked up my company and read about my work and watched a video of one of my conference presentations. And he said he was proud of what I'd accomplished and ashamed that he'd never taken the time to understand it before. And he asked if we could talk sometime, and I wrote back, "Yes, we can talk," because despite everything, I wasn't ready to close that door completely. Marcus sent a series of texts over the next few days. The first one's angry and defensive, calling me selfish and accusing me of humiliating the family. Then guilty and apologetic, saying he'd been a terrible brother and he understood if I never wanted to see him again. And then finally silence. And I didn't respond to any of them because I needed time to process decades of dismissal, and I wasn't ready to absolve him just because he'd finally noticed I existed. 2 weeks after the dinner, my mother called again and asked if I would meet her for coffee, just the two of us, and I agreed because I was curious whether this change was temporary or real. And we met at a cafe in Hyde Park on a Saturday morning, and she looked older somehow, more uncertain, and she said, "Your father and I have been talking a lot about how we raised you and Marcus, and I need you to understand something about your father's relationship with his own brother." And she told me about the golden child dynamic in my father's family, how his older brother had been the favorite, and how my father had resented it his entire life. And she said, "I think without realizing it, we recreated that same pattern with Marcus. And I pushed for it because I was afraid Marcus would struggle the way your father did, and in trying to prevent one kind of damage, we created another." And I listened to her explain the psychology behind their choices. And while it helped me understand, it didn't erase the hurt. And I told her that, and she nodded and said, "I know, and I'm not asking you to forget or immediately forgive. I'm just asking if you'd be willing to let us try to do better." And I looked at my mother across the table and saw something I'd rarely seen before, genuine remorse and a willingness to change. And I said, "I need boundaries this time, real ones. No more assumptions that I'll give money or time or emotional labor without being asked. No more comparing me to Marcus or dismissing my achievements. And you have to actually show interest in my life, not just acknowledge it exists." And my mother agreed. and she asked me to tell her about my work. Really tell her. And I spent an hour explaining what I actually do, and why it matters, and what my team is working on. And she listened with real attention, asking questions that showed she was trying to understand. And when we left the cafe, I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe something could be salvaged from the wreckage. 3 months after that first coffee meeting with my mother, my father came to one of my speaking engagements at the Cincinnati Convention Center, a tech conference where I was the closing keynote speaker addressing an audience of 800 professionals. And I saw him sitting in the third row looking uncertain and out of place in his casual clothes among the business attire, and my mother was beside him taking photos with her phone. And that small gesture of attendance meant more than I'd expected it to, and after my presentation, when people lined up to ask questions and network, my parents waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. And when I finally made it over to them, my father's eyes were red, and he hugged me hard and said, "I had no idea, Sarah. I had no idea you were this accomplished, this respected, and I'm so sorry I never asked, never cared enough to find out." And he was crying in a way I'd never seen him cry. And my mother held my hand and said, "You were magnificent up there, and I'm so proud of you, and I'm so ashamed that this is the first time I'm seeing you do what you do best." 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, Marcus sent me a letter, an actual handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, and I almost threw it away without reading it, but something made me open it. And his handwriting was messy and urgent, and he wrote 4 pages of genuine self-reflection that surprised me with its honesty. And he said, "Sarah, I've been in therapy for 2 months now trying to understand why I became the person who could demand half of your lottery winnings without ever once asking how you were doing. And I'm starting to see how much pressure I felt my whole life to be the successful one, the golden child, and how much I was actually failing at everything while you were succeeding. And instead of being happy for you, I pretended you didn't exist because your success made my failures more obvious, and I'm not asking you to forgive me or even respond to this. I just need you to know that I see what I did, and I'm sorry, truly sorry, and I want to be a real brother if you'll ever let me try." I read that letter 3 times, and then I called him, and we met for lunch at a small restaurant in Clifton. And it was awkward and uncomfortable and honest in a way we'd never been with each other. And he told me about the pressure of being the favorite when you're not actually good at anything, and how every bailout from our parents felt like another confirmation that he couldn't succeed on his own, and how he resented me for making everything look easy when really I'd just worked harder without anyone watching. And I told him about the loneliness of achievement without acknowledgement, and how I'd wanted to share my successes with my family, but learned to stop trying because the rejection hurt too much. And we both cried in that restaurant booth and agreed to start over, to build something real instead of the hollow sibling relationship we'd performed for decades. The rebuilding was slow and imperfect. There were setbacks and misunderstandings and moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, but my parents kept showing up, asking questions about my work, remembering the names of my colleagues and the details of my projects, and they started inviting me to things without expecting me to drop everything, respecting when I said no and celebrating when I said yes. And Marcus and I developed a cautious friendship based on honesty rather than hierarchy, and he stopped asking our parents for money and started actually working to rebuild his career, and I helped him with his resume and interview prep, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because he'd finally seen me as someone worth knowing rather than someone worth using. I learned something important during those months of careful reconstruction. I learned that I didn't need their validation to know my worth. I'd built a remarkable life and career without their approval, and that would always be true regardless of whether they acknowledged it. But I also learned that having genuine connection felt better than vindication. That being truly seen by the people who'd overlooked me for so long brought a different kind of peace than the fierce independence I'd cultivated in their absence. And the lottery win became a family legend, the turning point where everything changed, though I knew the real transformation had nothing to do with that $50,000 and everything to do with finally demanding to be seen. Now, when I stand on stages across the country speaking to audiences about innovation and leadership, sometimes I spot my parents in the crowd, and we make eye contact and share a genuine smile, and the recognition is finally mutual. They see me for who I actually am, and I see them trying to become better than who they were, and I'm whole with or without their approval, but grateful for the second chance we're building together. And when people ask me about the lottery win, I tell them the truth, that I'd won years ago when I decided to build a life of value on my own terms. It just took my family this long to see it.